Hello, and welcome to our 3CX video tutorial, which will focus on a functionality which we hope you will never need to use, dialing emergency numbers. On February 16, 2020, in the United States of America, a law called Kari's Law came into effect where multi-line telephone systems, also known as MLTS, basically PBXs, will need to meet certain requirements when 911 is dialed. Kari's law states that calls to 911 should be able to be dialed without a leading prefix, for example, a 9 or an 8 in front. Also, when 911 is dialed, certain designated personnel within the organization should be notified that an emergency number has been dialed. First of all, let's see what is required by the business owner or PBX admin before we start to configure the PBX with the necessary settings. To fully understand the new requirements, let's explain some of the terminologies used. An emergency response location, or ERL, is required to be determined. The ERL refers to a physical location of the premises where 911 emergency personnel will be dispatched. This could be, for example, the first floor of a building, second floor, or XYZ building in a multi-building campus. We recommend you refer to local or state laws to determine the requirements and what is considered a valid ERL in your local area or state, as these could differ from state to state. An emergency location identification number, or ELIN, is essentially your outbound caller ID number, or DID. This is a 10-digit number which will identify the specific location of the premises. In addition to this, the ERL, or emergency response location, is a specific location within the premises. This might be a specific building at an address, a specific floor, or even a specific office. The ERLs are associated to at least one ELIN. More ELINs or DIDs can be allocated to an ERL, as you might have multiple people in a particular ERL, for example, the floor of a building. The ERLs and ELINs are allocated via your SIP trunk provider. When a call is made to emergency services, the ELIN will be sent to the provider, who will in turn pass it on to the emergency services. The ELIN that is sent out should be a DID that is routed to the original caller of the emergency services directly, or to a responsible entity within the organization, whether this is a campus security officer, front desk in a hotel, etc. The ELINs should not be routed through a digital receptionist, queue, or ring group. An actual person will need to answer as soon as possible. To make the differentiation between ERLs and ELINs a bit clearer, let's have a look at some examples. In the example you can see on the screen, the entire premises will be under one ELIN and one ERL. When a call is made to emergency services, 911 that is, the ELIN or caller ID that will be shown to the 911 personnel will be the main number of the building. 911 dispatch will have the ERL as XYZ building. We are assuming, for example, that the state law defines that given the size of the building, that the entire building is able to be defined as one ERL. This is why it is important to get legal advice as to what the ERL requirements are for your state. Moving on, we can see a second scenario where the building is now segregated into its different floors. When a user on the top floor calls 911, the ELIN that will be sent out will have the top floor defined as the ERL. So the dispatched emergency personnel will know that they need to go to the top floor. The ERL could be, for example, XYZ building, top floor. If a user from the middle floor calls 911, the ELIN and ERL will be mapped to the middle floor, so emergency responder personnel will know that they need to attend to an emergency on the middle floor. We showed the example of a single building in these examples, but in a campus of various buildings in a university environment, for example, this could be University of State, Administration Building, ground floor. An ELIN is required by a SIP trunk provider, and they usually allow the definition of the e911 address of the ELIN through their online portal. This isn't always the case, however, and you may need to contact them to have this done manually on your behalf. Should any of the details change, it is entirely up to the customer to update and maintain this information. Let's go and see how we configure all of this in 3CX now. Emergency numbers in 3CX are created from the general settings of the PBX. All emergency numbers will need to be identified and added as emergency numbers from the PBX settings page. With 3-digit deployments, please be very careful with the assignment of extensions which could potentially be emergency numbers. You should never create an internal extension of 911, for example. The name of the emergency number can be anything you want, as long as you can identify which service is which. The number will need to be written exactly as it is to be dialed. For example, 911. No prefixes are required, and in the case of Kari's law, a prefix is not wanted. You can also limit from which extensions or extension groups the emergency number can be dialed from. For example, if the business is located in multiple countries, you can limit the extensions from outside the USA from calling 911, and extensions from outside Europe from dialing 112. This also allows the definition of the calling policy, so we can separate the extensions based on their ERL. Let's see some examples of the configuration of the emergency numbers. 911 is used in all cases, but we have assigned a different emergency number name. This will be our policy name. More on the policy name shortly. We can see that we have defined the emergency names as 3CX-HQ, followed by the floor. You notice that the extensions are defined for each floor separately, with the relevant extensions and extension groups defined for each rule. When the PBX detects that the emergency number defined has been dialed, the PBX will try to process the call on the first route, just like any other outbound rule. If for any reason the provider is busy or unavailable, then the PBX will attempt to process the call on the second route, then the third, fourth, and fifth routes accordingly until the call gets processed. When using multiple providers, please ensure that each of the providers has the correct information for the location of each ELIN used to dial out. This is usually done from the provider's portals, as we mentioned earlier. Coming to Kari's law now, and its requirement to inform the designated responsible personnel. 3CX is in a position to inform the designated personnel, which may be a safety officer or a security guard, for example, when an emergency number is dialed. The notification can be in the form of an email, a chat notification, or a pre-recorded message which is broadcast to a number of extensions. The email notification can be sent to specific email addresses. Multiple email addresses are possible by simply comma separating them. The emergency number notification will also be sent to the PBX admin if the option to send an email when someone dials an emergency number is selected. The message created in the template earlier can also be used to create a chat message to certain extension users. Before the chat messages can be sent, however, the Allow Chat option must be enabled in the PBX general settings. Then the chat message can be sent to the extensions defined with the manager role in the extension group of the extension calling the emergency number. All the extensions within the extension group, both users and managers of the extension which dial the emergency number, or to all the group managers of all the extension groups in the PBX. If you want even more control over which extension users will receive a chat message, you could create a new extension group. In this group, you would add all the extensions as users, except the extensions that you want to receive the chat notification. Those extensions will be added as managers of the new extension group. Moving on, let's see the notifications template which will be used to send a message in email and chat form. The admin can define a very specific message template to be sent to the designated personnel. The variables which can be used to populate the message are the policy name. The policy name is the name of the emergency number which we created earlier on. This should identify the ERL, the emergency number which was dialed. In the examples we saw earlier on, we had 911 being configured as the emergency number. The designated personnel receiving the email or chat messages will see that 911 was dialed. The extension which placed the call to the emergency number will also be presented to the recipients of the notification. And finally, the name of the extension which made the call. Sometimes just seeing an extension number is not sufficient to know who placed the call, so we can also present the caller's name, which is taken from the extension first name and last name. These variables can be used multiple times within the message. Finally, a pre-recorded announcement can be broadcast to certain extensions. The message can be played back to a single extension. This could be a security officer, for example. It can also call a ring group, and the message will be played to the first extension that answers. Or you can send the recording to a paging group to broadcast the message to all the extensions in that paging group. You can record the message from any extension in the PBX, just like you would for an intro prompt of a digital receptionist or queue. Or you can upload a pre-recorded message. Just ensure that the WAV file used is in the proper 3CX supported audio format when uploading. That is a WAV file encoded as PCM, 8 kHz, 16-bit mono, and a maximum file size of 100 megabytes. After all the configuration has been completed, you should test the setup to see that the correct information is passed on to the security personnel as well as the emergency dispatchers. One way to test the internal communications is to add a new emergency number, but instead of adding 911 as the emergency number, add your own mobile phone number and call it from one of the extensions. An email and chat notification should be received by all the necessary recipients, as well as the broadcast announcement calling or paging the relevant extension or ring group or paging group defined. Don't forget to remove this additional rule after the test. To test external communications with the emergency services, most providers have a test number, which will allow you to verify that the correct information is sent to the 911 emergency services. An example is 933. Please verify with your provider, however, of their correct procedure to perform the test. Calling 911 without having an emergency is not recommended. Your provider should have experience with such tests and will be able to provide you with a proper procedure. Now to see the whole process in action. When someone within the organization or hotel guest, for example, dials 911, the call will go to the local 911 dispatch center. We can see on the diagram that the person calling 911 is on the third floor in this case, which comes under ERL-A and ELIN-A. The 911 operator will see the call coming in with ELIN-A coming through to them. They will now know the address of the ERL-A. They will then dispatch the emergency responder personnel to the ERL from which the emergency number was dialed from. At the same time, when 911 was called, the responsible entity within the organization will be notified, who will initiate the predetermined company emergency protocol. They will wait for the emergency responders to arrive at the designated location. The emergency responder personnel will be taken to the person needing the emergency care. As a summary, let's have a look at what needs to be done in an easy-to-read flow. We can separate the different tasks into 4 categories. We have the legal issues that need to be sorted out before we start the configuration. Then we move on to the configuration that needs to be done either on the provider's portal or manually from the provider after input from the admins, in the case where self-help is not available from the provider. Then we set up the emergency numbers in 3CX to take care of the external communications with 911. Then, finally, the configuration of the internal communications to the designated responsible personnel. All the shown items have already been described earlier in the tutorial. Please feel free to go back and see each step in detail. So let's go and demonstrate how to create the emergency numbers in 3CX. We will go to Settings, click on General, ensure that Allow Chat is enabled. At the bottom we have the emergency numbers, click on Add. Define the name of the rule. This will be the policy name in the notification message. Define the emergency number. Since we are defining the numbers for the first floor, I will add the extensions which are on the first floor. I can add them as extensions, or I can define them as extension groups. Select the VoIP provider that you wish to send the call to, and define the outbound caller ID. If you have more than one SIP trunk provider, you will need to define all the providers which can be used for 911. Otherwise, click on OK. I have defined an emergency number for the first floor of the 3CX headquarters. If I need to define for any other floors, I will need to add more emergency numbers. Depending on my ERL, I might need to add a second ELIN and click on OK. After I have done the configuration, I can define the template. And I can modify both the subject and the body of the message that will be sent. Moving on to the notifications now. We will select to send the email. We will define the email addresses. We have defined 2 email addresses for the message to be sent. We will enable chat. We will select all the group managers. And we will play the announcement. I will select the ring group, which is defined for the emergency broadcast. This is a paging group. I will select the prompt and click on OK. At the top of the general settings, I will need to click on OK again. That's all that is required on the PBX in order to create an emergency number. Thank you for watching another 3CX video guide. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and enable notifications to get the latest 3CX updates.